has the head of a major NATO country come out and said what feels like the obvious, that President Trump is a Russian asset? Just why is Portugal coming out and saying this now of all times? And what does it mean for the direction of NATO and the EU? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Slap that subscribe. Okay, so this is a wild story, actually, because this is as explicit as I've ever heard a NATO country be about President Trump's relationship to Russia. This is from the Portuguese president, who said publicly that Donald Trump was, quote, objectively a Russian asset, and warned European leaders about downplaying Trumpism. Now, what I think is so interesting about this is, first off, remember, the Portuguese, they are a NATO country. They are a developed first world nation. So they have access to a tremendous amount of intelligence that we aren't party to. And this is the Portuguese president, who admittedly, on some level, is more figurehead in Portugal than a day-to-day leader, right? This is not someone who's directly controlling the Portuguese military, but he is the chief of the country, and he is not certainly without power. And the power he wields, especially, is his ability to cast these sort of statements. So what he said is, quote, describing Trump, he said, the supreme leader of the world's greatest superpower objectively is a Soviet or Russian asset. He added, Europe has downplayed Mr. Trump and Trumpism, right? And now you're going to go, oh, well, this guy is from the Socialist Party of Portugal, but when you look up his bio and you understand, you put it in the context of Portugal, you realize that this is actually a very centrist, very seasoned guy. This is someone, again, who was has been in Portuguese politics his entire life, and including years and years during the Portuguese Estado Novo, which was like a sort of mildish dictatorship, a dictatorship that was less brutal than, say, Franco's. But this is someone who has been a long time politician. I mean, you can see here that basically he was a member of the Portuguese Assembly, Secretary of State for the Presidency's Council of Ministers in Portugal, Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs, president of the Social Democratic Party, which in Europe, this is like a centrist party, basically, maybe like a little center left, but not much. Again, he was leader of the opposition party to the government, and then he became the 20th president of Portugal. And the idea is that when he became president, he actually surrendered his party status. So this is somebody who was seen as a hugely respected guy. I'm trying to think of an analog. There is no analog position in the United States, but this is somebody who is known and seen as a symbol of the whole country, a unifying symbol for Portugal. And I say this to say that this is not someone who's going to come out and take these stances in order to like score electoral points. There is no election he has to win, right? His only job is to be the leader of the Portuguese people collectively. And so for him to come out and say these things, particularly when he was talking to a gathering of youth members of one of the largest Portuguese political parties, this is a pretty troubling statement, right? And he showed what we've said on this channel that should feel very familiar to you guys. He said that while Trump makes these terrible threats from his Twitter account, that he's going to sanction the absolute shit out of Putin, none of these promises have been fulfilled. In fact, the only, quote, sanction that we've seen is the 50% tariff against India for buying Russian oil. But it's kind of interesting that India came out, Modi, the prime minister of India, came out a few weeks ago and said, hey, Trump says he brokered this ceasefire between us and Pakistan. India's like, that's not true. And Pakistan was like, oh, no, yes, it is. And we have nominated President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. And so President Trump, again, whose only value is rewarding loyalists and punishing detractors, of course, he's going to slam the U.S. ally India and elevate Pakistan, who notably harbored the U.S. most notorious terrorist for decades. And so it's hard to sit there and go, oh, this was really applying sanctions this was an act against Vladimir Putin, because the number one buyer of Russian oil, the number one buyer of financier of the Russian government, the number one provider of consumer goods to Russia is the People's Republic of China, which is, again, a country that Trump has talked really tough against, but is currently still, again, getting a reprieve on tariffs. And you might recall that twice now Trump has sworn he's had a deal. We got the deal with China. And then mysteriously, the deal falls apart and China gets another tariff suspension. So if we were interested in punishing buyers of Russian oil, well, we would go after China. So he's dead right that he's only elevated the Putin. Right? You may note that, for example, he took Putin from being an international pariah to literally rolling out the red carpet for Putin. And Putin never changed his stance on Ukraine, not once. In fact, Putin was able to blatantly lie to President Trump's envoy about his willingness for peace. And when that lie was exposed, President Trump said, I'll look into doing something about it later. You're like, damn, dude, you've been so loyal to Putin. Why are you letting him just lie to you? So, right, this is, I think, this has to also be couched in the fact that the, U.S., we have, again, robust evidence going back years and years and years that President Trump is a Russian asset, or is at least supported by Russia. And I say this because the evidence is pretty sprawling at this point. First off, you have the bipartisan Senate report authored by current Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which states that Russia engaged in a systematic hacking and propaganda campaign against the United States to support Trump's candidacy for president, right? And again, you have the Mueller report, which states that they were unable to prove that Trump's coordination with the Russian government, which did happen, didn't rise to the level of criminal conspiracy because it requires some kind of tit for tat. But Robert Mueller said, we tried to interview a bunch of people and we tried to gather a bunch of documents from the Trump campaign. And on numerous occasions, they actually obstructed justice. So he goes, we were unable to complete the findings, which is weird given that if it was a total hoax, as the president claims, you think that he would cooperate fully with the investigation simply to put an end to that issue. So again, there's already been robust evidence effectively proving that the president is in cahoots with Russia in some capacity. But you also have, of course, a growing number of Russian assets coming out and saying, hey, President Trump was recruited as a Soviet asset nearly 40 years ago. This is literally coming from the former head of Kazakhstan Security Services, a KGB officer who had been in Moscow at the time. Remember, Kazakhstan, currently a free country, but under the Soviet Union, it was a subordinate republic. Think of it like a state in the Soviet Union. And again, he said, this is according to this former KGB officer who said in 1987, I was with a directorate of the KGB in Moscow, and the most important work of the sixth administration, his office, was the recruitment of businessmen from capitalist countries. And right, it was in that year that our administration recruited a then 40-year-old businessman from the United States, Donald Trump, under his handling call sign Krasnov. And as they point out, that the president or the then businessman Trump had married a Czech national, which again, at the time was a person from behind the Iron Curtain, made numerous trips to Moscow, et cetera, et cetera. This has been rehashed a bunch, but the president continues to insist that he has no connections to Russia, that he has never been backed by Russia, and he has no loyalty to Russia. He calls it a hoax, but you may know also that he calls his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein a hoax. So unless you believe that those photos of him and Epstein together were doctored, and all that video of him and Epstein together were also doctored, then you have to sit there and go, Trump calling something a hoax is probably evidence that it's true. Now, again, what is interesting is that, again, we talk about the this guy has said that while the so-called Steele dossier was unable to be verified or possibly just artificially constructed and sold to the DNC, that doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? Masiev says there was compromise on Trump. He said this back in 2018. Again, he said in 2018, quote, Trump is on the FSB's hook and is swallowing the bait deeper and deeper, evidenced by indirect facts published in the media. There's such a thing as the recruitability of an object. Based on my experience of operational work in the KGB, I can say that Trump belongs in the category of ideally recruitable people. And this is something that is not a tradecraft isolated to the KGB, right? When you want to recruit an asset in another country, what you have to do is find someone who is recruitable. And usually, again, look at, for example, Eric Adams, right? New York mayor, charged with being recruited by Turkish intelligence, who assisted him by funding his campaign and providing him benefits. And so what you do is you find someone who has some kind of transparent need, right, or vulnerability. And at least what I was trained in all of the counter recruitment training that I received is that you get like an intelligence agent is going to be looking around a foreign government or something. They're going to be looking around for a vulnerability that makes you recruitable. And so that'll be, for example, let's say I was massively in debt and I hid it from my spouse, right? And I was trying to keep up appearances and I was getting desperate. If, let's say, the Russian government knew that, they might say, hey, listen, man, we know you're broke. Why don't you repeat a couple of talking points for us on your videos? Or when I was at DHS, why don't you just give us a heads up into some of these investigations? And in exchange, we'll help you pay off this massive debt you're in, right? You can also do it with vices, things you really want. Let's say I was somebody who loved gambling, right? I didn't have gambling debts. I just loved it, right? And I loved going. Well, maybe a Russian asset might say, listen, or a Chinese asset might say, listen, do you want to go gamble in Macau? Why don't we? Listen, I've got a company. You're going to be a contractor for this company. Obviously, we're going to ask you to, look up some stuff that's going on with the U.S. government in China. But then you can take a flight to Macau. You'll do some consulting, but really, we're just going to credit you a couple tens of thousands of dollars to go gamble in Macau. And, if you're somebody who's highly motivated by that, that'll work, right? So in the case of a businessman like Donald Trump, right, he wants real estate deals and he wants his ego stroked. Well, it's funny how, again, as we point out, there was in 1984, before the fall of the Soviet Union, when a centrally planned economy was like, Donald Trump, why don't you come and build a skyscraper with your name on it in Moscow? It's sort of insane. Like, if you don't think it's suspicious that a Soviet country would invite an American capitalist to come to their country, build a tower, and put the capitalist's name on it, like, if you don't think that there's something nefarious going on, you're kind of insane. Like, there was nothing in the early 80s in Moscow named after a fucking capitalist, okay? So, like, again, that's what's conventionally known as a clue. And so all this to say, this is something that he's probably stating aloud that almost every NATO country knows. So the real revelation by this Portuguese president isn't so much that, hey, Trump's a Russian asset, because savvy people, right? People who understand how to read an intelligence report, how to understand what's being said when certain people say certain things, right? There's a language to diplomacy. There's a language to government. There's a way things are said where people in the know understand. And they, when those things are said, everyone in the know knows exactly what's going on. We all understand that Trump was compromised early in his business dealings, and he has remained loyal to Putin throughout his career. He's remained loyal to Russia. right? And other assets. I believe he's also probably on the take by some Middle Eastern country like the UAE. But the takeaway is not that other NATO countries are going to go, oh, wow, Portugal said he's a Russian asset. It must be true. And it's not that the Portuguese public or the public in Europe is going to go, oh, wow, Trump's a Russian asset. What he's saying is, guys, you can't keep playing ball with this guy. At some point, we Europeans have to look at each other and go, listen, we can't continue to give this person credibility. We can't continue to give them intelligence sharing. We can't continue to lean on them for military or diplomatic cover and support. He goes, the only people we can rely on is ourselves. And that's the direction we have to start taking things. That's what he means by downplaying Trump and Trumpism. It's because you notice the Europeans, right, had to go to Trump and they had to try to strike some kind of trade deal to prevent these tariffs. And he's like, listen, don't rip the Band-Aid off. This is a bad person who wants to actively damage Europe and Europe's security. And he's like, the sooner you excise him, the easier it's going to be. And so that signal, I think, is one of the most dramatic about this entire story. If you guys want to support me and the team and keep me independent, able to speak truth to power when it seems like no one else can, you need to become a member at combatvetnews.com. This is my version of Patreon, where every Tuesday and Thursday, I drop an uncensored combat video from the front lines. Oftentimes, it's footage straight from units who send me their vids from the front. So if you want to see the latest tactics, strategic moves, and how things are really happening on the front lines, become a member. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, guys like Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Need, Alan Lutz, and CM Holmes, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. We could not do this without you guys. You guys make the channel what it is. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Hit subscribe. Cheers.